Explore the unseen.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. We've got quite a stack of sources today, haven't we? A real mix of academic papers, psychology articles, some philosophy, neurobiology.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. The kind that really makes you think about, well, who's actually running the show in our heads? We tend to assume it's all conscious thought, you know?
Exactly. Like, I decide I want to pick up my mug, and so I do. It feels like my conscious command.
Right.
But these sources, they suggest that might just be the surface layer. What if most of what drives us, how we learn, what we choose, how we act, is happening underneath all that?
That's the big question running through all this material, isn't it? So our plan for this deep dive is to unpack these sources you provided and really explore the powerful role the unconscious and subconscious seem to play in learning, decisions, intuition, pretty much everything.
Okay, so where do we start? Maybe just getting the terms straight. When the sources talk about unconscious and subconscious, what are we really looking at? It sounds like it's broader than, say, the old Freudian idea.
That's a really key point, yeah. They're generally using these terms to cover all the mental processes that are operating, below the threshold of conscious awareness.
So the background stuff.
Exactly. Think of it like the brain's automatic operations, shaping thoughts, guiding learning, handling coping mechanisms, all without you needing to deliberately focus on it.
So it's not just about hidden desires or conflicts necessarily, though that could be part of it. It's also just the brain doing its job efficiently.
Very much so. And historically, before we had the tech to study things like subliminal messages, the whole idea of the unconscious was more linked to just unintentional actions, things you did without really meaning to.
Okay, that makes sense. And I saw this interesting historical debate mentioned. Was the unconscious mind smart or dumb?
Yeah, that was a big one. Early on, the thinking leaned towards dumb, kind of like simple programming. The idea was it could handle routine stuff, but not complex processing, couldn't perceive much without consciousness being involved.
Like tying your shoes automatically, maybe, but
Yeah.
not solving a complex problem?
Something like that, yeah. Subliminal stuff was often seen as too wet to really matter. But, well, as these sources show pretty clearly, that view has changed dramatically.
Right, which brings us to something really mind-bending in this material.
Yeah.
This idea of implicit learning, learning without even knowing you're learning.
This is huge. It's basically acquiring knowledge tacitly, meaning you pick it up without trying, and often you can't even explain what you learned or how.
It just happens by being exposed to something complex.
Sort of, yeah, just through exposure. The sources talk about classic experiments like artificial grammar learning, AGL, where people see weird letter strings that follow hidden rules and they get better at spotting grammatical ones without knowing the rules. And the serial reaction time task, the SRT task, you react to lights or symbols popping up and they follow a hidden sequence. Your reaction times get faster because you implicitly learn the pattern.
And I think I saw the SRT task might be seen as a better measure sometimes.
Yeah, some sources suggest that maybe because it feels more incidental, you're just trying to react fast, not actively looking for a pattern, so it might capture that pure automatic learning a bit better.
And across these studies, what did they find about people's awareness? Did they know they were learning the pattern?
That's the kicker. Consistently, going way back, in recent studies too, people show clear learning effects, their performance improves, but they often report being completely unaware of the rules or the sequence.
Wow.
It really seems like our brains are constantly, quietly scanning for and absorbing patterns under the radar.
That is genuinely incredible. And something that really jumped out from the sources was that this implicit learning ability, it can be independent of, like, standard IQ.
Yeah, that's a striking finding. You could theoretically score lower on a traditional intelligence test, but still be really good at implicitly picking up complex regularities in the world around you.
Okay, that's fascinating. But then the sources also mentioned it does seem to correlate with how well people do in school in things like English and math. How does that work?
Right, they found that link too. It suggests that this hidden ability, this implicit learning skill, it's actually playing a pretty important role in real-world learning, like at school. Even if it's not what IQ tests usually measure directly, it helps you pick up language structure, mathematical patterns, maybe without you consciously realizing how.
So how does conscious thinking fit in? Does trying to learn explicitly help or hinder this implicit stuff?
It's complicated. The sources show it can go both ways. Sometimes, consciously trying to figure out the rules, that explicit search, can actually get in the way of implicit learning.
So trying too hard might mess it up.
Kind of counterintuitive, isn't it? But other research shows that explicit instruction combined with implicit practice can actually boost performance. And once you do gain some conscious knowledge about a pattern, that can then help amplify the learning, make it faster or stronger.
A delicate balance then.
Definitely. It seems to depend on what you're learning and when the explicit knowledge comes in.
And this implicit learning, it's fundamental for skills, right? Like riding a bike, playing an instrument,
Yeah.
that sort of thing.
Oh, absolutely. And the sources even touch on that feeling of choking under pressure.
Yeah.
When you've learned a skill implicitly, so it's automatic, and then suddenly you're stressed and start consciously thinking about every single step, that can totally derail the smooth automatic process.
The conscious mind getting in the way of the automatic skill.
Exactly. And other things matter too, apparently, like how tired you are, how motivated. Even things like hypnosis can influence this implicit learning. It's sensitive stuff.
Okay, so we're learning skills, soaking up patterns, all without necessarily knowing it, which naturally leads to the question, how much are our decisions also driven from below the surface? I saw a statistic in the sources that was, well, it was pretty wild.
Oh yeah, that 95% figure. Some sources cite that, suggesting that a huge chunk of our experience, decisions, actions, emotions, behaviors, might be driven by the subconscious, happening automatically.
95%, that just sounds huge. Almost like we're just complex robots reacting.
Well, the idea isn't necessarily that we have no conscious control, but that the subconscious handles a massive amount of processing automatically. It filters sensory input, manages responses based on past learning. It's about efficiency, really. Imagine trying to consciously process every single piece of information coming at you.
You couldn't function.
Right, so the subconscious does the heavy lifting. But that raises the question, even when we feel like we're making a conscious choice, say, deciding between coffee or tea, how much of that decision was already underway unconsciously?
Yeah, and this is where the neurobiology gets really challenging to our everyday experience, isn't it?
It really does. Sources discussing the neurobiology of decisions note that whether a choice is based on external evidence or internal preference, the underlying neural processes look quite similar. They involve integrating information into these sort of decision variables.
Let's fluctuate.
Exactly. Partly due to random neural noise. So the variability in our choices, why we sometimes pick one thing and sometimes another, comes partly from this noise and partly from the brain balancing things, like exploring new options versus sticking with what works.
And then there are those studies,
Yeah.
the one that's showing brain activity before we're aware of deciding.
Yes, the famous Leavitt experiments, and later ones like Soon et al. In 2008. Measuring brain activity, they found signals, for instance, in the frontopolar cortex, that could predict a simple motor decision like pressing a button with the left or right hand with, above chance accuracy,
How far in advance?
up to 7 seconds before the person actually reported being consciously aware of making the choice.
7 seconds.
Yeah.
That's a long time in brain terms. It feels like my conscious decision is just catching up to what my brain already decided.
It definitely challenges that intuitive feeling of, I decide, then I act. Findings like the readiness potential, that buildup of brain activity before a voluntary move, were initially seen as pretty strong evidence against our usual idea of free will. The brain's getting ready before we even know it.
But I saw the sources mention newer ways of looking at that readiness potential.
Yep.
It's not totally settled.
No, not at all. Some newer interpretations suggest the readiness potential might partly reflect just random fluctuations in brain activity, background noise that eventually crosses a threshold, triggering both the conscious awareness of deciding and the action itself.
Okay, so maybe it's not the brain deciding, then telling consciousness, but more like a process reaching a tipping point.
That's one way to think about it. It helps bridge the gap a bit with our intuition, but as the sources make clear, there are still big questions and philosophical hurdles. It's far from resolved.
And that really points to the deeper philosophical problem here, doesn't it?
Absolutely. How do you square our common sense idea of a unified self making choices based on reasons with this picture from neuroscience, where decisions seem to emerge from noisy neural processes or thresholds being crossed?
It's hard to map one onto the other.
Very hard. And some thinkers argue that this empirical evidence really challenges that notion of a single executive self pulling the strings.
Okay, so if our brains are prepping decisions beforehand,
Yeah.
and so much is subconscious, unconscious bias seems like a really clear, real-world example of this hidden influence in action.
Spot on. Unconscious or implicit bias is a stark and significant example of how these automatic below-awareness processes affect our daily lives and judgments.
So what exactly is it? based on the sources? Is it just prejudice we don't admit to?
Not quite. The key distinction the sources make is that it's about unconscious attitudes and stereotypes influencing our understanding, actions, and decisions without our awareness. It's not usually intentional or controllable in the moment.
So it's not deliberate malice.
Generally, no. It stems more from the brain's natural and often useful tendency to create mental shortcuts, to make quick associations and generalizations based on patterns it's learned from society, culture, personal experience.
But those shortcuts can lead to unfair outcomes.
Precisely. The sources highlight how pervasive this is, especially in areas like hiring, promotions, performance reviews, even just everyday interactions. And it's not just race or gender. Bias can crop up based on appearance, accent, education, whether someone's a parent, disability, lots of things.
And the result is decisions that end up favoring one group over another, unintentionally.
Yes, leading to real inequities.
So if it's unconscious, what can we actually do about it? How do you fight something you don't know you're doing?
It's tough, but the sources suggest strategies. A big first step is simply awareness, acknowledging that everyone has biases because our brains work this way. It's not about being a bad person.
Yeah.
Then, things like sensitizing people, especially in roles where decisions have big impacts, like HR. Training can help people learn to recognize situations where bias might creep in and implement checks and balances to promote more objective decision-making.
And I saw a mention of different types of strategies, implicit versus explicit.
Yeah, briefly touching on approaches like subtly exposing people to counter-stereotypical examples versus more direct methods of consciously identifying and challenging biased thinking. There was a reference to how this played out in political campaigns, trying to counteract potential biases.
It's amazing how these hidden currents show up everywhere. Let's talk about some other ways the sources say the unconscious makes itself known. What about intuition, that gut feeling?
Intuition is a classic example, described as that sense of knowing something without quite knowing how you know it. It feels immediate, right?
Yeah, definitely. And the sources connect that back to the implicit learning we talked about.
They do. The thinking is that intuition often arises from all that implicit learning accumulating over time. Your brain detects subtle patterns and associations below the surface, and this surfaces into your conscious awareness as a feeling, a hunch, a gut feeling, a sense that something is right or wrong. Some studies mentioned even show that people report intuitive feelings about a pattern before they can consciously explain what the pattern is.
And I saw a connection mentioned between intuition and interoception, being aware of your body.
Yes, the idea that being more tuned into your internal bodily signals, heart rate, butterflies in your stomach, might be linked to picking up on those subtle intuitive feelings. Apparently, mood and stress can also affect how much we rely on intuition versus deliberate analysis.
Makes sense. What about social intuition?
That might stem specifically from implicitly learning social cues, reading people, understanding dynamics, possibly involving things like the mirror neuron system that helps us understand others' actions and intentions.
Okay, and then there are dreams, the classic window into the unconscious, right?
Definitely. The sources largely agree that dreams offer valuable glimpses into our subconscious landscape, reflecting emotions, fears, desires we might not be fully conscious of. Understanding them can even offer clues about mental health.
Like recurring nightmares potentially signaling unresolved stress or trauma.
Exactly. And they suggest practical things like keeping a dream journal or talking about dreams in therapy as ways to explore what they might mean for you. They also touch on the historical views, like Freud's ideas about wish fulfillment and Jung's different take.
There's also that interesting point about just expressing things, crying or talking or writing things down. How does that connect?
Yeah, referencing Pennebaker's work on self-disclosure, the act of putting thoughts and feelings into words seems to help us process them. It externalizes them, lets us look at them differently, gain some understanding and perspective. It's different from just endlessly ruminating on something.
Right, active processing versus getting stuck.
Right.
And briefly, there's that mention of a link between subconscious connection and reporting. Unusual experiences.
Yeah, an intriguing idea from one source suggesting people who report things like sensing others' thoughts or having predictive dreams might, in some way, have a higher level of subconscious connectivity. Still speculative, but interesting.
So we've got all these powerful hidden processes shaping us.
Yeah.
The big question then becomes, can we influence them? Can we interact with this invisible side, or are we just passengers?
Well, while a lot of it is automatic, the sources do suggest the subconscious isn't entirely fixed. It can be conditioned, as one source put it. It learns and it filters information based on the beliefs and patterns it holds.
And often those ingrained patterns or beliefs can be negative.
Yes, that's a strong theme. Sources suggest many people carry deep-seated negative beliefs, fears, feeling inadequate, that kind of thing. One source cited over 70% of people having these. And these subconscious beliefs can directly conflict with our conscious goals and intentions.
So you consciously want to succeed, but subconsciously you're running a program that says, I'm not good enough.
That's the dynamic described. And this leads to the idea of consciously working to reprogram or update the subconscious. By identifying and challenging limiting beliefs, consciously choosing and reinforcing more empowering ones, changing that internal self-talk.
Trying to get the conscious and subconscious pulling in the same direction.
Exactly. It's presented as a potential key to gaining more control over your life's direction.
Which inevitably brings us right back around to that huge, thorny question we touched on. Free will. If our brains show activity before we feel we've decided, and so much is driven by these automatic subconscious programs, what does that mean for free will? Do we have it?
It's arguably the biggest philosophical challenge highlighted by all this material. How do you reconcile the neuroscience and psychology with our powerful, intuitive sense of being in conscious control, of making free choices?
And the sources show there's absolutely no easy answer, right?
Yeah.
It's a massive debate.
A huge ongoing debate. Some see the neuroscience as fundamentally undermining traditional ideas of free will. Others argue it doesn't, perhaps by redefining what free will means. Maybe it's not about initiating action out of nowhere, but about our capacity to act in line with our reasons and values, even if those actions are ultimately caused by brain processes.
That's the compatibilist view, sort of. Free will compatible with determinism.
Right, that's one major philosophical approach. Others, incompatibilists, argue that if our actions are determined by prior events and brain states, then genuine free will is impossible. And some argue maybe our whole intuitive folk psychology notion of a freely willing conscious self is just wrong and needs to be revised or abandoned based on the science.
Maybe free will is more about the conscious intention we have as we act, even if the process started earlier unconsciously.
That's another angle people explore. The sources are clear. There's no scientific or philosophical consensus on what free will is, let alone whether we have it in the way we usually think. But we certainly feel like we do.
And it seems our choices aren't just plucked from thin air in the moment either. They draw on that rich history of accumulated information, as one source beautifully put it.
Exactly. All that implicit learning, the biases, the conditioning, the past experiences stored below awareness, they all feed into and shape what feels like a spontaneous decision right now.
Wow. Okay, so we've really journeyed through the hidden depths, haven't we? From just defining these terms to seeing how the unconscious and subconscious influence learning, skills, decisions, bias, intuition, dreams, even shaking our core ideas about self and control.
It really underscores, based on this material, just how incredibly pervasive and powerful these below-awareness processes are. They're not just some minor background noise. They seem deeply involved in almost everything we do and are.
In understanding this, digging into these sources, it really does offer valuable insight, doesn't it? Into why we act the way we do, why others act the way they do. It moves beyond just abstract ideas.
Absolutely. It helps make sense of automatic reactions, ingrained habits, why changing behavior can be hard, why intuition feels the way it does, why tackling bias needs more than just willpower.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, here's a final thought to chew on, something these sources really prompt you to consider. If so much of your experience, your thoughts, actions, learning, choices, is shaped by these deep hidden currents below conscious awareness, what does that truly imply about the nature of the self you experience every day? And how much conscious steering of the ship do you really have? Something to ponder.